Thank you very much. And I wonder after the last talk which cell in the grid this might fit into. You can tell me. Now, unlike grapholinguistics, which we're told from the website is not a neologism, psychotypography, I think, is a neologism. And I was interesting to see that it's also, or once described as a psychiatric symptom. So a word that has meaning only to the person who uses it. So I see this as a form of psychotherapy. I'm talking about work in progress. It's very exploratory, it's subjective. So it's just some thoughts. But others have said something along the same lines. Merrill Rolstadt was the founder of the Journal of Typographic Research, which I think was 1967 that it was started. And it was a journal that was supposed to, or intended to, publish scientific investigations into reading and into the typography of reading. And what he said a couple of years into the journal, after the journal had started, is that we ought to establish ourselves, we typographers, ought to establish letterform research as a subject in its own right within psychology. It shouldn't be sort of hidden within psychology. And this was picked up subsequently by Sophie Bayer in 2016. But also, I have to say, some of the rationale for this is personal. I've already said it could be a form of psychotherapy. I think I had an identity crisis quite early on. And in 2019, I explicitly said that I was sitting on the fence between typography and graphic communication and psychology. So here we are. I'm not the only person to use the term. I found two other uses of it. This one from a type tasting blog, which describes psychotypography as the effect of the typographic environment on the emotions and behaviors of individuals. And a second one, again, pulling out the emotional resonance or connotations of psychotypography. So for me, this is quite a narrow definition. It's looking at the sort of subjective judgments that we might make about typefaces. And I wouldn't say that the brain hears through the eyes. So I will say that psychotypography is concerned with the perception of visual material, primarily textual, by readers and designers, because I've always been interested in the expertise that designers bring to their perceptions, and combining the study of how we read with the visual attributes of what we read. However, as I worked on this talk, it seemed to me that it might be easier to divide into two fields, one within typography and one within psychology. So within typography, psychological methods are often used and applied to typographic variables. And within psychology, our perceptual processes are discussed in relation to typographic variables. So that might sit sort of more comfortably. I'm not really into frameworks either, but I thought I needed to organize my thoughts. So first of all, I had to select a load of publications that I thought fell within the realm of psychotypography. So this is incredibly biased and subjective. Although I used a review article 2025 by Sophie Bayer and Myra Dyson, so the references in that, I used some of my own references when writing on legibility, and then I added and subtracted as I went along, thinking, does that fit within or does it not fit within? So it's very much coming from my perspective as to what the journal publications are that form this data set. And then what I did was to try to categorize the publications in some way. So initially I talked about topics, but as I hope you got from the title, I'm trying to use the metaphor of trees, which, well, I'm not a gardener, it's a bad idea, but so the topics become branches of the tree. The method I'm not actually going to talk about, but there are very many different methods used in psychotypographic research. I looked at, or thought it was useful to look at, what patterns there might be in terms of the discipline of the researcher or the discipline of the journal. So psychology, typography, possibly something else, and cross-referencing. So if a psychologist writes a paper, do they include typographic references within that paper? Because I want to fit in 20 minutes, I'm going to focus on branches and collaborations. This is the Excel spreadsheet, or a bit of it. So it starts with Émile Javal in 1879, writing on eye movements, and ends up with David Brezina in 2026 with his article in visual cognition, which might come up later. So what did I find having sort of created this spreadsheet? Well, it was very much a top-down analysis. And actually, I'm not usually doing this sort of thing. So bear with me. I think the roots of psychotypography are in legibility, eye movements, printing, and legibility was termed reading hygiene initially. And you see here the cover of Huey's book on the psychology and pedagogy of reading, which refers to the hygiene of reading. And the work initially, so the roots came from quite a range of disciplines, from ophthalmology through psychology and to graphic design, typographic design and type design. And when I use typography or psychotypography, I'm using the term typography loosely to cover type design, graphic design, and probably printing as well, kind of a shorthand. And those same disciplines are represented today, I'd say, in current research. The branches I've chosen to talk about briefly are typeface connotations, font regularity, and visual crowding. And our keynote speaker was talking a lot about connotations this morning, so that's rather handy. But before I do that, I want to introduce a parallel branch of word recognition research. Parallel because typographic variables rarely feature in word recognition models. So it seems to be sort of going alongside psychotypographic research. And we see on the bottom right a model, one of the early models on word recognition, where we recognize features, identify features, then letters. These letters are abstract letter identities, ALIs, or abstract letter codes. So any information about the font or about the size or about the case is thrown out. Hence, typographic variables aren't in word recognition models. And then we go from the abstract letter codes to the word representations. And I think we owe a great debt within psychotypographic research to Kevin Larson, who in the early 2000s did a talk I wasn't at to typographers about word recognition models, because apparently typographers were a bit behind and they had other word recognition models. So I see him as a conduit between psychology and typography, and also he's facilitated a lot of research that I think is psychotypographic. So connotations, I've selected some of the papers, so please don't try to read them all, but just to give you a flavour. And the first one, Tannenbaum, is from 1964, using the word connotations, but there's also congeniality, semantic quality, personality, print personalities. So there's a number of different ways, I think, of describing connotations, but I think meaning the same thing are subjective views of typefaces. And I'm very Latin-centric, or the research is, but in the centre bottom is one that looked at print personalities in Arabic. And Arabic also has personalities in its typefaces, according to a psychologist. There's also a whole set of papers, I would say, on branding and logos, which also pick up on connotations, but I've not included them here. And I don't think they're part of word recognition models, or haven't been part of word recognition models, except that a couple of papers have found that it does matter what words are written in what typefaces. You would say, of course, if you're a typographer. So if we take the word heavy and we put it in a light typeface, we will slow down in reading that, which says to me that we can't be chucking out the font information in our word recognition model. Some of the time it carries on through and gets into the linguistic codes, it interacts with it. So we've got connotations sort of making a link between subjective and objective judgments, and I think between psychology and typography. The next branch is font regularity or font tuning, a favourite of mine, not as thick a branch. It was first explored by Thomas Sanoki in a PhD, and the first paper there, I think, was probably the first paper he published on it in 1987, I think. And font tuning or font regularity refers to the fact that we tune to the characteristics of a font as we read. So if we keep in that same font, we don't have to get a new set of characteristics. And I love Dimitri's first slide, because by changing colours, you were probably a bit of a hiccup on that. So various research has been done and reviewed. The last two I will point out, Dyson and Bayer and David Bretzina's, because I think it, well, in the first case, it applies to typographic practice, or it can be applied to that and is not purely theoretical. And in David's case, it's much more nuanced and gets into the structure and the nature of font regularity or coherence, which is very helpful. And these I see these later research papers as buds that might grow. Next branch, visual crowding and letter spacing. This is a simulation from Pelly's paper, which shows that in our central vision, his eyebrows, we can clearly identify the letters. But when we go out to the periphery, the letters are jumbled because there are adjacent letters there and we can't resolve the letters quite as well. So this simulates that. And as you can probably imagine, if you space the letters more, then you might help with the crowding, be less crowded. So I'd say three perspectives illustrated here on crowding. The first one about the visual processes, so central and peripheral vision. One illustrated here, bottom right, that included work with people with and without dyslexia, because that's introduced quite a lot as a possibility of helping readers with dyslexia. And the one I like, well, not just, but mainly, you can't see what the words say, middle left. So this was in the Journal of Research and Reading, and it was done to inform how we should design children's books, and actually found that the word and letter spacing in existence is about right. But I just love the quote from a child, "You can't see what the words say," because it seems such a wonderful explanation of visual crowding and better than anything I could do. But I thought I'd throw in a couple of less healthy branches, things that annoy me, basically. And I hope you might have come across, well, no, perhaps I don't. Have you come across bionic reading? This way it's supposed to, we're supposed to be able to read faster if there's bold on the first letter or letters of a word, and it should be less mental fatigue. I think this is a lack of understanding of how we read. And you'll see that, lovely, this, to the point, no, bionic reading does not work. And the one on eye movements showed that our eye movements are not different when we're reading in that bionic form. So let's hope that that branch withers. And this fluency, this is one of, well, I've done this to death. So just this is the idea that if you make something harder to read, then we'll remember it better. And for Sans Forgetica, designed to help students study. No, it doesn't. They couldn't find that with Sans Forgetica, and David and I have actually done a study on Sans Forgetica. So no, throw out disfluency as well. So just on collaborations, now this is where I got back to my trees, because I understand that you can graft branches or roots, let's say roots together artificially, and then they'll grow up into something different. I think it goes wrong if you've got white blossoms and pink blossoms, because I think you're supposed to do something to the rootstock. As I said, I haven't got a clue. Why did I do this? But inosculation, which I found, is the natural growing together of branches or trunks. So I think that's interesting in terms of collaboration. Have we artificially put people together, or have they naturally sort of moved towards each other? But in a more formal manner, looking at disciplines, I've used before these three categories, which are very well integrated in terms of interdisciplinary research, multidisciplinary, not, or separate contributions from each discipline. So what collaborations have there been? I'd say this is Poulton, a psychologist at the Applied Psychology Research Unit. And I'd say he was borrowing because he brought in typographic experts to advise on the material that he was using, which I think is an excellent example of using another discipline's skills. Units have been set up, and I'm guessing this one was interdisciplinary. At the Royal College of Art, the Graphic Information Research Unit, as it became known, and there's a great paper by Linda Reynolds in Typography Papers that describes the work. The unit was set up by Herbert Spencer, designer, in 1966, and Spencer and co, both designers, worked with Reynolds, a psychologist and information scientist. So I'm thinking that was probably interdisciplinary research. I shouldn't really try and categorize them because I wasn't part of the teams, but I'm thinking possibly this Hartley and Burnhill work was multidisciplinary. So we've got a psychologist and a typographer. I think they got together around 1968. I found a paper from 1971. And I think you'll probably work out which of the images is the psychologist and which is the typographer. Not that I stereotype people. And then there are larger scale collaborations. And I initially thought that Gordon Legg and Charles Bigelow had just published one paper together, Does Print Size Matter for Reading, which I would have described as multidisciplinary because it has findings from vision science and typography very separate. But then found that with larger collaborations, they've done quite a lot of other work as well, published work, and that's include ophthalmology and computer science. And then from South Australia, this has gone into neuroscience, which is something I stay away from, so I don't know anything about it. A couple of papers here published in Brain and Cognition, that's the investigating letter recognition and fontist fluency. And then the brainy type was published in the invisible language. And centres have been established. So Sophie Beyer has set up a great centre in Copenhagen, and there are many other publications that have come from that. Those are a couple. And a research group, which I'm going to say nothing more about because Marta and Anne will be talking about research. So a bit of a plug there. And then finally, what I'm calling teaming up, because for want of a better word. So the work that David and I have done. And I'd say that I haven't discussed this with him, we started as multidisciplinary. And then as we carried on working together, we became interdisciplinary as, well, certainly me, I learned more about type design. Summing up, I don't think I've introduced a new idea, but I've perhaps elaborated upon it. It was, in a sense, proposed by Merrill Rolstadt. I've identified some branches or topics and given examples of past and current collaborations. And my final concluding thoughts. Is it helpful to define a field of psychotypography? So I thought I better put some positive points here. Yes, to support further collaborations and perhaps integrate research. And perhaps as a way, if there's a body of literature to inform researchers of what's relevant and going across the disciplines. but is it purely self-serving and egotistical because it's something that I think should exist? Early on, as you saw, I divided into the two strands, the two fields within typography and within psychology. But I think that's probably unwise because it perpetuates the separation. And it means that typographers appear to be only using psychological methods, whereas I think typographers are getting deeper into the visual processes. But I still think there's probably a tension between theoretical research and research that can be applied to practice. And then, with no attempt to answer this, how might psychotypography fit into the larger field of graphic linguistics, psychographematics? Thank you.
Thank you, Mary. We have 5 minutes for questions.
Thank you very much for what I get from your different talks, not the tool which I enjoy a lot, and also the literature that I know, which may be partial. It seems to me that most of the interdisciplinary activity involving perception, psychology, and typography is actually not so much about typographic aspects, but mostly about font, type design, or the general shape of letters, and maybe involving some micro-typographic aspects only, like kerning and tracking, for instance. So my question is, do you think there is, it would be interesting to study more higher level aspects of typography, such as the general shape of a paragraph or even a page?
Absolutely.
Because if you do, I'm working on that, and I want to talk to you after this.
Yeah, right. Yeah, no, definitely. In fact, I did have some literature that was sort of along those lines, ergonomic, perhaps HCI, because it was screen based. And I, a long time ago, did work on line length. So it was David's fault that I became focused on type design, I think. Yeah, but I agree. Yes. So.
Thank you for this talk. I have a question that in my head feels actually like provocative, but it's not.
No, don't worry.
So by way of stage setting, I'm trained as an anthropologist, so I come at this from an anthropological perspective. Is there, so I don't remember where your chart readings started, of research started, like 1880s.
It was Javal, because many people say that eye movements had started it. Yeah.
But they're like, James Cattle and guys who are doing this, who are students of Wundt doing this research, experimental research on type in the 1880s. You know, I read that stuff and it sounds very similar to the stuff that I do today, or that I read today. So my question is, in the 150 so years of research, the psychological cognitive perspective on type, what are the big findings that have changed the nature of the field? And if there aren't any, why?
I can actually only think of one, and it's not about typefaces, but I wouldn't be surprised if there are very few. But something that I jumped on was someone did work on, I think it was Slattery, psychologist, but interested in typography, on eye movements and return to the beginning of the line. So we've always been told that if you've got a long line, there's a problem with locating the right position. And what they found was that the eye, yes, doesn't always get into the right position, but it doesn't matter. It doesn't actually slow down reading because you're using that sort of incorrect position to look at letters to the periphery. And I just thought that would be sort of lost, and typographers won't know about it. So I think with, I suppose, more advanced measurement systems and neuroscientific work, we're perhaps uncovering a bit more. But yeah.
I don't mean to be provocative, because I look at it and I say, okay, look, I come at this from a social perspective as an anthropologist. And
Yeah.
I see, and I would argue to put in the collaboration things, bring in more. This is the collaborations are all sort of looking inward in experimental methods.
Yes.
But there's a whole world of researchers who are looking at reading as it exists in the world that have a lot to say that's quite different from what can be found in your lab.
Absolutely, but that would, yeah, it would be very difficult once you start broadening out. But I agree, there is question of ecological validity, yes. Yeah.
So one last question.
Yes, I was wondering, have there been research in seeing how different writing systems affect how the brain works? For example, I've written Arabic, because it's written from right to left, it affects the brain differently than our left to right script. And secondly, they have this root system where similar words have the same consonant with different vowels between. So I'm wondering, like, you know, Cyrillic, Arabic, how do these affect the brain differently than our Latin script?
I don't think I'm qualified to answer that, but I think there's surprisingly more similarity in how brain and how we process them works, despite what seems to be huge differences in terms of the material reading from right to left, etc. And there is a little bit of work on that. Yeah. So that good question. Yeah.
Thank you.
I have a last question. So on one of your slides, you wrote Microsoft Reading Team. And I wasn't sure if I had to read this as Microsoft Reading Team or Microsoft Reading Team.
Reading.
So, my question is, you are not a psychoanalyst, but do you think there's a psychoanalytical link between the fact of having a typography department in the University of Reading?
I would love it if they were, but no, I really don't think they were. Although it's the first female head of department or professor of psychology, Maggie Vernon, her research was on the psychology of reading. So maybe she was inspired by working at Reading. Yes.
Thank you. So our next speaker is Daniel Harbour, fellow of the British Academy, right now directeur de recherche au CNRS.